name is Bahman Mirshab. I'm Dean, College of Management. On behalf of our president, welcome you to the second of our executive to executive speech series. Just to let you know that College of Management is the second oldest college here in this institution. And here in attendance, we have a few of my colleagues, and we have our academic vice president and provost, Dr. Ross. Could you please, and my colleagues, could you please stand up? So, thank you very much. Now I give the floor to my good friend, Mr. John Beebe, who's going to introduce the speaker. John.
Thank you. Morning, everybody. Thanks, Al. I have the pleasure today of introducing our speaker, Matt Friedman. Matt co-founded Tanner Friedman. At Tanner Friedman, Matt leads teams and he works directly with clients to develop and implement traditional and emerging communication strategies to support their business objectives. He has clients in many different industries, but he does have a number of top not-for-profit organizations that he works with. And in line with our topic today, Matt is a recognized crisis communications strategist, and he helps to guide organizations of all sizes through periods of bad news and times of change. Matt began his PR career at a large Metro Detroit firm in the 90s. He was a lead news producer at WDIV TV for their 6 p.m. news. He also, I didn't know this, but he began his career on the air and behind the scenes. He covered news and sports at WWJ, so a lot of experience. He now frequently serves as a broadcasting, news, and PR analyst for newspapers, magazines, websites, TV, and radio stations. And you may have heard, I think it was last week, Matt was on the CBS National News talking about the Uber CEO who had made some comments, and so they asked him about his feelings on that. Matt's a graduate of Syracuse University, and he serves as chair of the Children's Hospital of Michigan Foundation Board of Trustees. He's on a number of other boards, including Legacy Detroit Medical Center, the Michigan Sports Hall of Fame, Utumas Foundation for the Kids, Charity Motors, and the Detroit Regional Chamber Foundation. He resides with his family in West Bloomfield, and when not talking business, he loves to talk sports or continuing his ongoing search for the best barbecue joint in America. So with that, please welcome Matt Friedman.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for leaving your sweethearts this morning to come here and talk about a pretty serious topic. But I hope that I'm not just talking to you about this topic. I hope we're engaged in a conversation this morning, because crisis communication is one of those fields with a lot of nuance, where there's a lot of opinion and perspective that goes into trying to make the best decision for an organization in some really tough times. So the types of scenarios I'm going to be discussing with you today, I could categorize as some of the worst days in my clients' careers. So not to get everybody into a bad mood on Valentine's Day, but what we're talking about today is going to be a series of events that you hope will never happen to you. But it's inevitable that whatever type of business you're in and whatever type of organization you're here representing today, you're going to be faced with bad news. And it may not be a full-blown crisis. You know, years ago I used to do crisis presentations, and we would put people through hypothetical scenarios and pretend like they were standing in front of burning buildings, because that's what a crisis was like. But now in the information age that we live in, where text messaging, where social media posts, where rumors inside an organization can lead to a feeling of bad news, we all need to be prepared and know how to deal with those situations so they don't turn into full-blown crises. So I'm going to run through some best practices, some advice that I've learned in doing this with nonprofits and with businesses over the last 20 years. And then I hope to take your questions and get involved in a discussion with you and maybe even lead a discussion among you about some of your concerns, about situations you've been in that haven't gone as well as you had hoped. And we can even talk about some situations you've seen in the news or otherwise where you wonder, what were they thinking? And why was it handled that way? And the answer is, a lot of times, people aren't thinking. And that's why things end up being handled poorly or communicated in a way that makes you kind of scratch your head and say, what were they doing? So I'd like to walk you through a few things first, if we get the first slide, please. So let's start by talking about what happens before there's a bad news event, and whatever that looks like. And there are things you could be doing, there are things you probably should be doing to prepare. And I think that's the question in each of your minds I ask you to ask right now is, how well am I prepared in my organization for bad news, for some sort of adversity to happen, and how we're going to communicate it? Do you have a media policy? They asked me to talk about nonprofits specifically today, and I'm a big believer for nonprofits that everybody has to be in the same page about who speaks for the organization and when. I can tell you, based on experience and best practices, only a CEO or an executive director or a president should speak publicly for an organization, and only a board chair should speak for a board. And I think the last point is really important. One of the, and I'll talk more about this later on, but one of the things kind of unique to nonprofits is board members who are visible and active in a community thinking that they can speak for the organization. That makes a bad situation worse, even with the best of intentions. So it's really important to start thinking, if you haven't already, about what happens if there's bad news. And even if it's not speaking to the media per se, it's who speaks for the organization, and spelling that out and make sure that everybody in the organization understands that and knows that. And having a plan for a crisis. Now, a big corporation can have a big, thick binder that sits on everybody's shelf in everybody's office and says, this is our disaster plan. And a lot of those plans are written, if there's a leak at a nuclear reactor, how do we deal with this? But again, I encourage you to think of not just the worst case scenario, but sometimes a common scenario. What happens if there's bad news that has to be communicated? Sometimes the bad news is we need to close the office for a day. Maybe there's a gas leak in the neighborhood, something that's not even your fault. How do you communicate it? How do emails go out? How do texts go out? How are your audiences notified? Those are the types of things you have to think about in advance, because organizations that fare poorly in these situations often do so because they're not prepared, because they never thought about this before, or they chose not to think about it before because it's hard. So I think we can all acknowledge today that these things are hard. But how can you think about it ahead of time? How can you plan? That should be part of your checklist if you're an executive at a nonprofit or a volunteer leader at a nonprofit, to make sure the organization is prepared when there's any kind of adversity for any audience. So a lot of times you face adversity, you face bad news, but it's not a full-blown crisis. And one of the things I've looked at in sort of a post-mortem, when I've worked on crisis projects for nonprofit in particular, is at what point in the process could this have been prevented? Could a full-blown crisis have been prevented if the organization had done something differently at a particular point in time? And I can almost trace it back to what's known in the PR world as internal communication. Almost always, something that would just be bad news and would kind of pass in time if communicated well, turns into a full-blown crisis because it's not communicated well to the internal audience. Employees aren't happy with what they hear. Other constituents aren't happy with what they hear. They feel like the organization's hiding something. They feel like the organization wasn't honest with them. Or maybe the organization decides not to communicate internally about it, and then it leaks or comes out in some other way. You can almost always prevent an adverse situation from becoming a crisis by communicating well internally. And a lot of times, I'm brought into these situations too late. The internal communication got screwed up, and all of a sudden, there's an external crisis. So I encourage everybody, when you're thinking about planning and thinking about how we want to communicate when things don't go as planned or as well as planned, you start on the inside and you work from the inside out. On the same hand, board communication is really important in those situations too, because board members, if you're a nonprofit, are your ambassadors to the community. And if they feel like they weren't well communicated to, they're going to start talking. And you're probably not going to like what they're going to say. So one of the worst crises I've ever worked on with a nonprofit that involved fraud and all kinds of other terrible things, we were able to head off from being a public crisis because we communicated well internally, and we communicated well to the board, and everybody felt like they knew what was going on and what was going to happen next. It never permeated to the outside community. If it had, it might have meant a detrimental situation for the organization. Finally, in this set of advice is, and the graphic supports this, it's a metaphor I use all the time because it's often the biggest barrier to success in adversity communication, and we see it in nonprofits too, and that's a tug of war with your lawyers. Lawyers are trained to be risk averse. They are trained to say nothing in a time of bad news. As professional communicators, we have experience in what to say and how to say it. And a lot of times, we end up on opposite sides of the piece of rope. And the attorneys are saying, no comment, no comment, no comment. And the communicators are saying, here's what we need to say to the community. And you go back and forth and back and forth. And there are times I've worked with clients in a full-out crisis situation where I have to go into the meeting with the lawyers and cut the best deal for my client that I can. I know I'm not going to be able to say everything I want, but saying nothing is not an option. So we have to compromise. And a lot of times attorneys will want to release a statement where it is cumbersome and clumsy and legalese rather than communicating directly with your audience. Anything that you can do as a leader to avoid this tug of war from taking place will serve your organization well. And we can talk some more about that if you'd like and talk about some specific examples. But this is a serious situation that I think not a lot of people talk about. There are attorneys, by the way, I have to say, who understand this, and we get some of our best crisis referrals as a firm from attorneys who will admit that they don't know everything. But we've all worked with attorneys who won't admit that. And that can be a barrier to success in these situations. So you did the best you could to contain a situation, to have it just be bad news, and now you're in a crisis. Or sometimes a crisis presents itself unexpectedly, and there is no opportunity to try to contain it or to communicate with that internal audience to head off the crisis. What do you do? Well, number one, this should not be a do-it-yourself project, okay? This should not be like cleaning your gutters on a weekend or something like that. This is serious business and needs to be taken as such. And I've seen plenty of organizations who try to take it into their own hands with untrained hands, and they end up unsuccessful, and it's not surprising. So it's important to take advantage of any resources that can be available to you to help you through this situation, particularly if you've never been through it before. And also to have some outside perspective who can help you think like your audiences think. A lot of times, what happens in a crisis is people in leadership are so ingrained in their way of thinking that they have a hard time understanding why their audiences might not see it the way they do. And outside counsel and perspective can help with that. The second point here is something I ripped off from a client. I think I owe him a drink for using it today. I need to confess that I've used it. I used it on TV one time. I felt like I owed him a whole bar. And that is push people, not paper. It is very tempting in times of crisis to want to control the message to the point where all you're doing is pushing paper. You're sending out email. You're sending out statements. You're sending out letters. And in a really bad news situation where there's a human element to it, nothing addresses that quite like hearing from another human. So yes, there are times because of legal considerations and HR considerations, you have to be careful what you say. And you may have to craft that in writing. But at every opportunity to push people, not paper, to put somebody out in front, to communicate directly with audiences, to show empathy, to show compassion, to display the values of your organization, you need to take advantage of that. However, there's a caveat, and that is do not hide behind a spokesperson. And we had a situation in this market within the last couple of years where a nonprofit organization was involved in something that was very disturbing. It involved kids and pornography. And what the community organization did, instead of taking ownership of it, is they hired an outside spokesperson. And the board, accountable to the community and representing the community, and the executives of the organization who work for the community hid and put this spokesperson out in front. And I thought that was a huge mistake. And this is an issue that continues to haunt this organization to this day. Also, this spokesperson that they hired from the outside has a reputation of trying to make themselves famous rather than act in the best interest of the client. So it's a messy situation. So yes, it's hard when something bad happens at your organization to have to confront the public and answer questions about it. It's really hard. But my advice there is don't worry about the tough questions. Focus on answering the easy questions and communicating your message and get help doing it. So if you're an executive director or you're a CEO, you're going to have to get in front of your audiences as the person. And sometimes the issue is with the executive director or the CEO, so that means the board chair is going to have to get in front of audiences, answer questions, and speak for the organization. So what do you do? What do you say in these situations? I just made that sound easy while acknowledging that it's hard. What do you say? And there's three things, and I hope you walk away with these three things and tuck this away someplace. Put it in the notes on your phone or on your iPad, or take some notes and put it in a desk drawer. I hope you can bring this out when you need it someday. In any kind of adverse situation, your audiences are looking for three things. Number one, they're looking for facts, information. And I say facts as you know them. And that's because sometimes these are emerging situations and you don't know everything. So you have to say to your audience, here's what we know right now. Here's what happened. Here's why I'm communicating to you. Those are the facts. Number two is provide reassurance. In times of bad news, your audiences want to be reassured. They want to know that you're on it. They want to know that you acknowledge that this is important. Your audiences want to know that you're committed to doing the right thing, if in fact you are. I hope you all are. That reassurance is really important. And number three is concern for people. Anytime there's bad news in a nonprofit organization where you're supposed to be about serving the community and serving people, there's an impact on people, and you need to acknowledge that in your communication, that people are affected by what happened. And I believe, and I've been studying this and involved firsthand in this now for a long time, starting when I worked in broadcast news, that if you are successful in those three areas, communicating facts, providing reassurance, and expressing concern for people affected, you stand a chance of being successful in making it through the crisis. And sometimes it's just that simple. And if you look at organizations that do poorly in these situations, they're missing some of that. And, you know, I talked in the last page about what lawyers want you to do versus what communicators want you to do. And, you know, lawyers will tell you don't comment, don't say anything. So if you don't comment and don't say anything, you lose all of that. And I know that those are the three essential ingredients to being successful in these situations. The other thing that comes out a lot is, okay, we've had a crisis and we've communicated, and now what do we do? How do we make it go away? How do we turn the page? So I've been spending a lot of time with a client, a nonprofit out of town actually, elsewhere in Michigan, that is really moved now from crisis mode to crisis recovery mode, and that's taken some time. I think the crisis mode really started in July or August, and here we are in February, and I think they're still in recovery mode, making some incremental progress, which is what you have to consider in your expectations. So what happens after a crisis? You need to keep communicating. You can't just do the crisis communication on the day the crisis happens and then go back to being quiet. That doesn't work. Audiences need to hear messages over and over and over again, to understand them, to remember them, and to believe them. So you hear a lot in business about crisis being an opportunity. I believe from a communication standpoint that crisis is an opportunity to change the way you're communicating and begin a new pattern and process of communication. Important to remember, you're never just one email away. I worked on a crisis a couple years ago with an organization that had made a very controversial decision to fire their leader. And every couple of days, I'd get a call, including on vacation, from a board member saying, I've got it. I'm going to send you this email, and you could take a look at it and then tell us when to send it out, because once everybody sees it this way, well, I know we'll put this behind us. And a couple of days later, I get a same kind of call from another board member. And my advice there is you're never just one email away from solving a crisis. Wouldn't that be easy? You know, we see that all the time when there's a crisis of media interest. And a client will say, you know what, let's write a letter to the editor of the paper. That'll get our message out. That's good. Let's do an op-ed. Yeah, that'll move us behind this. It won't. It might be part of an incremental process. It might be. But you're never an email away. You're never a letter away from solving something that triggers emotion, that triggers a reputational change. The other thing I hear sometimes is, well, let's just go out and get a positive news story, and that'll make everybody feel better about this, and then we'll be able to put this behind us. Well, there's no news organization on the planet right now that can reach everybody in your audience and all of a sudden change their opinion because of one story. This takes time, and it takes commitment. And I would argue that the crisis recovery and being able to move on from a crisis needs every bit of attention from an organization, if not more than any other phase in the process that we've talked about. And we can all think of organizations, I'm sure, in our heads that have had some kind of adversity, that have had some kind of bad news. And that lingers. And that when a reputation changes on a dime, it takes a long time to get it changed back. So those are my initial thoughts. I was hoping to not only get some questions, but get some conversation going. I don't think you want me to tell war stories all morning of working with nonprofit organizations. I worked for an airline, and I worked for a cable company. So I have plenty of crisis communication stories I could tell. But I would prefer to answer your questions and get your thoughts and talk a little bit about what you're facing in your lives and in your organizations that might be able to help other people in the room. So, yes?
So, Matt, in the health and human services work that many of us do, the people we serve are protected by a myriad of privacy laws, rules, policies, and to the extent that the crisis might relate to a person we serve, family member, whatever, we have a lot of constraints in terms of what we can disclose. For example, where did they come from, what was their diagnosis, where they live, when were they born, any of that. And yet the media can get all that information from the local police if they were involved in the incident, and we're kind of handcuffed about how to confirm, not confirm, what facts can we give out? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't want to dismiss the legal considerations entirely. And there, like I said, there are times where we have to kind of cut a deal and say, how far can we go with this? But there's always an opportunity to communicate a message. So in a situation like that, you say, we are restricted by federal privacy laws on what we can say about this particular situation, but we are working with the police and say something about how you treat people and how you work with the people you serve and what the values are of your organization to provide a level of reassurance to the community that you're trying to do the right thing. And I think that's the piece that a lot of organizations forget, because the attorney's voice is so loud in their ear about what they can't say that they don't focus on the small window of what they can. And that's what I encourage everybody to think about. And we get in these situations with clients all the time. I feel sometimes like we're siblings vying for our parents' attention, and the attorneys get paid a lot more than we do. So they tend to get listened, and they have letters after their names and things like that, so they tend to get listened to more. And I think it has to be a balancing act.
Hi, I have a question, Matt. How do you define a fact and know, in fact, when a fact is a fact?
Well, we've heard a lot about that in the news right now. I think, a fact is a fact, and I think you can have perspective on what a fact means and how relevant it is. But a lot of times in a bona fide crisis situation, what your audiences are looking for is just to hear from you about what happened, or about here's what we know. So, there are times where we're dealing with, let's say it's a fire, okay, because everybody can understand what that example is. And I had one of these with a client, a for-profit client last year, a manufacturing company that had a fire in its plant. And if you look at what the CEO said in the interviews about it, he was able to say the fire broke out at this time in this room of the plant. It affected this many square feet. Our operation was on hold for a couple hours. It's back open today. I mean, to me, those are the facts that their audiences just needed to hear. They heard there was a fire at the plant. Does that mean the plant is destroyed? Or does that mean operations were impaired for a short period of time? And so I had to say to the CEO of the company, we need to clear this up for your audiences so they don't think you're out of business because of this. That's when I talk about the facts. So, political PR, by the way, is a completely different discipline. We can talk about that if you want. It's something of a political analysis has been something of a hobby for me the last few weeks because we don't work with campaigns and we don't work with partisan politicians. So I've been on the radio talking about it a lot. But the fundamentals and the bread and butter, what all you do, this is relevant. And that is sometimes you just need to tell your audience what happened so they can gauge the situation.
Thanks, Matt. Great stuff. Quick question. I know the basic principles exist across the board, but over the last 10 years, social media has somewhat changed the game a little bit. And I want to know how you counsel your clients regarding social media and how to interact with what goes on in comment sections and things like that that fan the flames of a crisis.
So, yeah, we have to look at social media from the very beginning, and a lot of times when we come up with a statement or we come up with a recitation of facts, the first place it's going to go is social media because that's a way to reach audiences quickly. And we do have to keep an eye on comments. I look at situations like during the recession, I was spending a lot of time all around the country working with clients on closing plants and operations and things like that. And the thing that we noticed start to happen is that while we wanted to let the employees know first, we knew it was going to become public within minutes because employees would start texting their relatives and or start posting it on social media. So it has to be a factor in all of this, and the way that information flows and the way that audiences are reached. You really have to act more quickly than ever. I think that's the lesson, is that we don't have the luxury of getting everybody into a conference room and hashing this out over 3 hours. Having that plan in place is really important. Having counsel is really important because we have to move quickly. I think the instances of like nasty comments and people not getting it on social media, that's more in the kind of business to consumer national retail space than it is what a lot of you would need to deal with locally in nonprofits, but the fundamentals apply. Yes?
My question is, can you give us an example of one case which was handled properly without naming, of course, the organization? And the second question is, given the current state of the nature with the president, do you think they are managing the situation perfectly? What's going on in terms of your assessment of the situation?
Okay. I will answer those in order. I was speaking to an MBA class at another university a couple months ago, and they asked me about, okay, can you give us an example of a crisis that was handled well? And I was kind of stumped. And because most of the time when it's handled well, you don't notice that it's handled well. You don't even know that something happened sometimes, or it happens so quickly that it doesn't stick with you. Those are sometimes how the best crises are handled. So one of the professors in the class started talking about the Tylenol example. That was in 1982. Like, we really don't have any better example. Is that how bad we are in the PR business? That we don't have any better high-profile examples of a crisis being handled well since 1982? And the fact of the matter is, a lot of them are not handled well. I mean, if you look at the GM ignition switch scandal, that was not handled well. Volkswagen was not handled well. Those are two particular examples in our area. But there are things that are handled well, adverse situations in our community every day. And it's because you don't hear about them, or it doesn't stick with you, or they apologize quickly, or they make it right by their customers very fast, that you don't even remember. And so I think that's part of the objective here is a lot of times we say to ourselves, implicitly anyway, let's not be remembered for how well we did this. Let's just try to do this well. To answer your second question, I'm very concerned, and this is not a political statement, this is a professional analysis. I'm very concerned about what this administration's policies on how they interact with the media and the public are going to tarnish the industry where I make my living. Because we have seen a lack of credibility and a lack of forthrighteousness over the last few weeks. And I worry that the public is going to think this is what PR is like, and it's not. They're violating, you probably were thinking in your head of all these things I was saying, and you're like, oh, the White House doesn't do that, and the White House doesn't do that. And there's a lot more in terms of day-to-day PR that they're not doing. And I believe that a price will be paid for that in terms of credibility and future. But I just worry about the doubt and the reputation that the way they're acting will cast on the rest of us and who are trying to make a living in this industry. So I'm concerned about that. I've been speaking out about that publicly. That has nothing to do with political policy. That has to do with how they're conducting business from a PR perspective. Yes?
Again, staying away from being political, there is a tendency these days where if something is repeated as so many times, it's a sizable part of the population, they seem to kind of take that as true. How do you fight something that is really not right? There are facts to prove it, but since there are devices or mediums through which repeated statement of the same incorrect facts, so to speak, how do you deal with that?
All right, well, here's something that everybody should remember for your own organization. If you don't speak for yourself, others will gladly speak for you. And by speaking for yourself and taking control of a situation and getting your own message out there from the beginning, you minimize your risk of the situation that you've talked about. So I'll give you an example, GM ignition switch. General Motors wasn't talking about it. So what did the automotive press do? They knew that my firm didn't do business with General Motors. We didn't have a conflict. My business partner and I were on TV and in print and on the radio every day for 2 weeks because General Motors wasn't talking. Was I saying what General Motors would have said if they had been talking? Of course I wasn't. They let me frame their narrative. Big mistake. So I think it's important to remember, if you don't speak for yourself, others will gladly speak for you. And that's where a lot of this comes from in business PR. Now, I think it's important to realize that business PR, which is what those of you who are in nonprofits need to focus on, is really different from the other forms of PR that you see on your phone, on your TV every day. You know, entertainment PR is completely different. That's about making someone famous and keeping them famous. That's where this whole myth about any publicity is good publicity is from. Any publicity is good publicity if you want to be famous, but not if you want to have credibility in your community organization. That myth doesn't fit. And political PR, as we've seen, is about trying to make one person look good. And in any of your businesses, when you get into a crisis situation, it's not about one person. It's about the organization. So I was involved in a situation a couple years ago where I was brought in by an organization where the CEO type was in trouble and really treading water in his job. And I had to tell him in the first meeting, I am not here to try to save your job. PR will not save somebody's job. I am here to try to save the reputation of your organization. And if you're interested in that, I can help you with that. Political PR is completely different. Political PR would approach that as, okay, we're here to save your job. What do we need to do? About making one person look good. So I think what happens, and I've seen this in meetings with well-intentioned people on boards and nonprofits, where they're just trying to help. But their frame of reference comes from the media that they consume and the movies they watch and the West Wing or whatever else. And they're thinking of entertainment PR. Well, any publicity is good publicity, right? No, not when we're talking about the reputation of the organization and its ability to continue to provide service in the community. And again, these political things that, I don't know, that they're watching House of Cards or something. It just doesn't work that way in business. Yes?
Matt, at the start of your presentation, you were talking about pre-event factors, and one of them was, do you have a media policy? Can you describe an effective media policy that a nonprofit should have?
Yeah, I think it may be as simple as what I laid out before, which is the only person who speaks for the organization on a day-to-day basis is the executive director or the CEO, and the only person who is authorized to speak for the board is the chair of the board. And I think it's important to maybe go a little deeper than that on what happens if there's a call or an inquiry, what process that should go through. It doesn't have to be hard, it just has to be unanimously agreed upon within the organization, and make sure everybody understands it.
To follow up on your question that he just asked and what you just answered, are there any questions that you normally ask or points that you, I want to say sell your clients on, but to have them be more proactive in a media policy versus reactive? Because you're talking about boards and executives and probably some communication departments. Getting them all on the same page ahead of time is usually probably better than waiting until a crisis comes. Are there questions that you're normally asking your boards in order to get them to think about this and start developing a policy?
Yes and no. It's really hard to get organizations to be proactive about this. And that's why I encourage it when I have an opportunity like this to talk to a group like this, because I think it's really important, but it's hard to think about. It's like trying to convince somebody that they need an estate plan. Like, well, nobody wants to think about that. Then it's like you have something happen in your family and it's like, oh shoot, we better get on that because cousin didn't have that. And that's what happens a lot of times in nonprofits where it's like, well, we can't, we have limited resources and we can't think about that, we have to focus on this. And then something happens to some other organization or a new executive director comes in and says, well, listen, what happened to me at my last place? And then they start thinking about this. So it's really hard to get organizations to think about things that they don't want to think about, that are hard. Like I said at the beginning, what we're talking about here for each of you is how to prepare and how to think about what's going to be one of the worst times in your career. Most people don't want to do that. Yes?
Related to that same question that you answered, you said in one of your slides that the media policy thing is that the chairman of the board makes the communication or someone is designated. But then that does not fit with your statement that don't hide behind the spokesperson. So if I'm part of the board, but I'm not the board chair, and someone contacts me and says, what is your company doing or what are your organization doing? And then I say, because only the chair has to speak. How do you deal with that?
No.
Yeah.
You misunderstood what I was saying. Allow me to clarify, please. When I said don't hide behind a spokesperson, I'm talking about an outside person or even sometimes an inside person whose role it is just to speak to the media on a particular situation in lieu of leadership. That's a mistake for a nonprofit organization. Corporation, I think, can get away with that. Nonprofit can't in the eyes of the public. When I talk about the board chair should be the only board member speaking for the board about a board action. Individual board members really have nothing to say about a board action. Only the chair should speak for the board. That's advice I've been given by governance people. I didn't come up with that on my own, but I've seen it be effective. So I think we're talking about two different things, and don't be confused by the semantics, please.
No, I agree, but the board member then is approached by media or whoever, and should he not talk at all, or should he say, please contact the chair?
Yes, I've seen it happen many times, and it works really well. And I actually had a situation with a client last year where I gave this advice to the client, and this one board member who was also on a school board, who thought being a nonprofit board member was like being an elected school board member. He didn't like this and he resigned while they were in crisis. Okay, sorry, you can't be famous because of this awful thing that happened at this organization.
Matt, I completely agree about presenting facts over the, those of us who have been doing crisis for 30 years, very important. Can you elaborate a little bit, or will you elaborate on the development of key messaging for your CEO or for your board, and what the role of nonprofit leadership is in helping the development of those key messages?
Well, I think, and I alluded a little bit to this in the question about how do you work around privacy violations? You still get a message in. You should know what the key messages are for your organization. And if you don't, you should develop them and get some help if you need it, so that you can always go to those messages. In good times, if it's a donor reception and you want to thank donors for being there, your leadership should be able to recite those key messages. And in tough times, when things aren't going well, but you want to reassure the community that you're committed to your mission, you should also recite the same key messages. And if you don't have them, you need them. I don't think it's a nice to have, I think it's a need to have. I've worked with a lot of organizations where before we've gotten involved, they kind of make it up as they go along, and sooner or later that's not going to work.
I think it's important to let the CEOs in the room know, or those who work with CEOs know, that when you're working with the media, you never know where an interview may go, but they need to focus on those key messages and always try to come back to those key messages, because that does help shape your fact.
Yes. Yeah, if nothing else, it communicates the organization's point of view. And the organization should always have a point of view. Even, like I said, in good times and in bad times. These messages will serve you well if they're developed properly. Yes?
Could you give us a couple examples of things that might be perceived as small that internally we might not see rising to the definition of crisis, but if we don't address it, it might turn into a crisis?
Yeah, I'll give you I can give you one example because I've been dealing with it now since last summer. And this is an organization in Michigan, but not in the Metro Detroit area, that had some staffing changes and made a lot of staffing changes at the same time because the board and the executive director believed that it was best for the culture and for the service delivery and fulfillment of the mission of the organization. And the people who ended up getting cut were people who, in a relatively small community, had trouble finding other jobs, and they banded together to try to go to war against the organization. And part of it is it was not handled, not communicated well when it was happening. And then it was almost like they made a bad bet, and the bad bet came due a few months later. And we've been dealing with this ever since. So I think it was one of those things where they chalked it up to, well, this is internal. And then it got external. And the organization's been accused of all kinds of terrible things by these people who have this vendetta. And then it's really tough for the organization to say, well, they just have a vendetta. They're just disgruntled former employees. No, they have to be able to acknowledge these issues and attack them head on. So it's been a real challenge. And I think that's when you talk about small stuff turning into big stuff, it's almost always about personnel and internal or a policy change, or a lot of what we've seen in nonprofits is organizations have started to focus or refocus their mission. So that means some level of service is not being delivered to someone who expected it, or a grant is not going where it used to go because that money is being redirected elsewhere. And the communication in those situations is so fragile and so important that doing that right will prevent it from coming and bubbling up to a crisis that could really negatively affect the organization.
Hi. I'm going to try and direct this question back to social media and actually give you an example, and perhaps you can shed some expertise on this. Okay, great. So I work for a school district, so that gears you with where my interest lies. The Build the Wall video, did anybody see that? It was all over social media. It was a local school district, not mine. But do you have any tips for how that school district could have handled that social media explosion?
I don't remember what the school district said about it. I follow the news voraciously, and I follow crises and controversies, and we work with schools and school districts in our firm. I don't remember what the school district said about it. So I guess with the benefit of hindsight, my memory was the school district should have said something memorable about it to provide reassurance. And I'm not sure that they did. I don't know. Maybe they did. I don't remember. which is not a good sign, by the way. So if that had happened in one of the schools that we work with, my counsel would have been, come out strong and talk about values and talk about diversity of opinion, whatever it happens to be. I'm not going to come up with the line. They need to come up with the line based on what really happens in their organization. We'll help them amplify it, maybe modify it. So I guess that's my advice: is be memorable. Say something that your audiences are going to connect with. And it's tough when, in today's environment, it's tough to be political because nobody wants to offend anybody and everybody wants to respect that they're both sides. But I think educators in particular, they know when lines are crossed. And I would encourage them to point that out when they really know that a line was crossed.
Another question I have. We have two of our faculty members here, Dr. Jackie Stavros and Professor Matt Cole. They teach management courses. I'm wondering if you talk about crisis management in your classes.
So next week we're talking about communication, but they always put crisis communication at the end of the chapter, but that's my taking big notes, but
Yeah, thank you. My impression is that most people who come up through management aren't exposed to any of this until they have to deal with it for the first time. And their initial instinct is to clam up or not want to talk about it. And I see this in corporations. A lot of times the CEOs, the path to the CEO office is through finance. So they don't think of any of this. And it tends to be a little bit better in nonprofits because the path to the CEO office tends to be through development. So at least they've worked with the community before and the people before, and they know their audiences and can focus on that. So I have found nonprofit CEOs to be much more coachable and to have much better instincts in this situation than on the corporate side, where a lot of times they have to start from scratch when they're facing it for the first time. So it would be nice if they learned about it in school.
I might steal some of your stuff and take you out for a drink.
Okay.
So on following up with what Dr. Stavros says, I teach undergraduate human resource management here at Lawrence Tech. And one of the cases that we are looking at is the Wells Fargo ethical crisis from last year and how to deal with that. And we address it from the perspective of an HR intervention. However, following up with what you're talking about today, I use an example from my school district, which is Plymouth Canton Community School District, where whenever there is any type of issue, like recently there was a snow day that the community was complaining about because it was icy in the morning, but in the afternoon the weather was nice, but yet they didn't call a snow day. And immediately, about 10 o'clock, the superintendent sends out a voicemail to everybody. She posts an email. So the point being, as you said, immediate communication, get in front of it, have a leader or somebody that is a spokesperson for the organization, a message on cue, on point. And so from what I teach the students is exactly what you're saying, communication, get out in front, and get behind that message, but be very, very proactive. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, and again, I've seen examples like that, and they're good examples, and one of the reasons why you forget about them is because as a consumer, your need for information and perspective is fulfilled very quickly. And then you move on with your day. You don't think, wow, that was handled great. Like, well, I got what I needed out of that. Yeah, thanks for explaining that to me. Okay, I'm going to go back to what I was doing before I took that phone call. Yes?
Matt, talk a little bit about donors and funding sources as an audience and communicating to them a little bit more specifically in a crisis and how direct that needs to be versus a little bit more of a shotgun approach.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm glad somebody asked about that. You're going to have to pick up the phone sometimes. When I talk about push people, not paper, the donor audience is a really good example of that. You work really hard to build relationships with donors, and you're going to let them know in person when something good happens. You need to let them know in person also when something not so good is going on so that they hear it from you and they hear it in context. They can hear the tone of your voice or at least have the opportunity to have a phone call. And I think, again, if you try to do this through pushing paper and just cranking out emails, social media posts, and press releases, the relationship quotient, which is so important in what you do in nonprofits, gets missed. So I do think it's really important to look, when something happens, audience by audience, and figure out how and when does everybody need to know. And with donors, that if the personal touch is going to make a difference to make them and keep them a donor, then you need to apply that same personal touch when you're communicating bad news, whatever it might be. And a lot of times I've worked with organizations where I say to an executive director, VP development, call your top 10 or your top 20 or whatever it happens to be. And then I follow up with them in a day or so and say, how'd it go? And most of them said, you know what, they just said, thank you for letting me know. They didn't think it was that big of a deal. Well, that wasn't what they were expecting. Usually they're thinking this is going to be a really tough call. So it's just, when you talk about pushing people, not paper, it's where those people connections are really important.
Can you talk a little bit about the psychology of the apology? Like in crisis, I always wonder why the apology is not used enough. The public is very receptive and sympathetic to apologies. And when apologies are given, people move on. They tend to accept the apology and they move on.
I think that is driven by the litigious nature of our society. I don't think it's as much psychology as it is business. And I will often ask clients, nobody's perfect. No organization is perfect. Sometimes you make mistakes. Acknowledging mistakes is refreshing candor to audiences most of the time and allows you to move on. But the lawyers get afraid that if you acknowledge a mistake, you're getting set up to be sued. And when I talk about that tug of war, that's what that tug of war is about quite often. So, and it's unfortunate because there are companies that should just admit that they made a mistake and talk about how they're fixing it and they're going to move on, but they won't do it because the lawyers won't let them do it. And then they look like they're bad or unsympathetic or don't care about people, especially nonprofit organizations. When we see this in healthcare a lot, well, if we say we made a mistake, does that mean we're going to have a malpractice suit? I don't know, but I do know how audiences respond to that.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
Being a nonprofit organization and when I think about the population that we serve, there are times a story could hit the media, and it has to do with maybe a program that we may have. If it's, I just want to say it could be foster care, it could be disability, and we may be contacted by the media to respond. There are times you kind of put in a negative position because the other party may be a funder. It could be a government agency, and so you want to respond, but you're afraid to step out because it could impact your funding. How do you handle a situation like that? Could there be negative feedback coming back towards the organization because we refuse to respond?
I would disclose that to the journalist who makes the inquiry, because that may end up providing a conflict that they weren't even aware of, and they may not even want you to talk about it. So obviously this is very situational, but it comes down to having open, honest conversation about these things. And again, if you're focused on people, not paper, what happens in a lot of organizations is, oh, I got this voicemail, I got this email, that means we need to respond to it. Let's write a statement and email with a statement. And sometimes I just say, can we talk about this? And then we talk about it and we find out, well, you know what, that organization you want us to talk about, they're a funder of ours. So wouldn't you think that was a conflict? Oh yeah, sorry, I'll find somebody else.
Okay. So it is okay to do that then.
So yeah, I mean, we need to talk more about these things and not just push statements around the internet. That's how we make progress all the way around.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry.
I'd like to ask you to broaden your response to Gary's question about the donor communications beyond the crisis to donor communications in general. I've seen a strong tendency among nonprofit organizations to have only positive news make it out to their donors, and then when something comes along that has been building and building and building, they're surprised. Can you make any comments about the value of sharing the challenges and struggles of the nonprofit so that the donors are not getting sugar-coated news all along the way?
Yeah, it's a tough line to cross, and I think that most organizations play it way too safe, and they end up having to pay a price for that afterward. I was working last week with a group of alumni from a college in Indiana. This college announced 2 weeks ago that they were going to be suspending operations for a year, 1,900 students, hundreds of faculty and staff. They're going to kind of take a year off and see what happens. The alumni aren't real happy with this, and they couldn't get a meeting. So they, one of the alumni leaders is a client of ours, and we did this for them as a separate project. And one of their issues is the school is having serious financial trouble, and the alumni had no idea. They would have galvanized around trying to do something to help this situation if only they had known. They were concerned about transparency and a lack of candor. Now, one of the risks you take in communicating when things are bad financially is you can only do that once. So if you want to rally the troops to try to help you out and kind of save your organization, you can do that, but you can only do that once. If this alumni base had been engaged, they would have done it, but they're not going to do it next year. They're certainly not going to do it in 5 years, but they would have done it once. So I think you have to be judicious about this, but you also can't be afraid of saying when you need help with something, letting people who are willing to help you be in a position to help you. I think it's just more important to have these conversations than anything else. Again, I think what happens a lot of times, and I've seen it in nonprofits, is they take the political PR approach, which is our job is to make one person look good. Our president's got to look good. Can't do anything to make him look bad. Well, sometimes in the life of an organization, there are times when things aren't going great and you need help. And you have people who are willing to help you. You got to figure out how to take advantage of that and make it work for everybody.
I'm coming.
Somebody was trying to protect the president of this college. Guess what? It didn't work. He looks really bad now.
Working in development for a religious organization, how do you get the point across when, you know, back in the day there was a lot of bad press, different situations. Oftentimes people can't let it go and just generalize that every religious organization falls into a certain category. How do you tactfully explain that you're not part of the masses?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned religious organization, because John and I actually had this conversation when we were talking about what I was going to talk about here today. And I've had more crises at religious organizations that I've worked on in the last 5 years than anything else. I can't explain why and how they're connected. I think part of it is that there are membership organizations, and a lot of times there are business people on boards who don't know how to communicate with the members in a membership organization, so it doesn't go well. And also they're fueled by emotion and passion, and that tends to spill over sometimes. You know, I think if you're trying to distinguish yourself from other organizations or trying to move away from perceptions, it takes a long time. It's really hard work. It's kind of one individual at a time. And that's when I talk about you're never just one email away. You're never just one newsletter away. What if I get questions like this all the time. Well, we're different from everybody else, so let's just write something that's really good and then everybody will get it. It doesn't work that way. Reputations take a long time to develop. They can change very quickly, and to try to change them back takes a long time, and it's hard work. And sometimes it's, you know, in development, sometimes it's one donor at a time, and that's tedious. But I think everybody's expectations need to be managed to understand the task at hand.
So would you say then, when you're talking to a specific donor, you're pretty much talking about your organization and building it up?
Yeah, I think it's the fundamentals of what we do in brand communication. You communicate who you are, what you do, and how you're different. And even in a crisis, you have to do that.
John is coming down. I'll call you if I have a crisis. What do? You come and ask me to tell you the truth? Or you say, look, let's sit down and
see what we can do before the news gets out.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times we don't have the luxury of even having a meeting. I mean, I get calls at night, and I get calls in the morning, and I get calls on vacation, and sometimes we have to figure it out very quickly, and I have to go based on what I'm hearing and on instinct. But I always have to, if it's somebody I know and somebody I've worked with for a long time, that's easier. A lot of times I'm getting a call from somebody, like I said, on the worst day of their career, and have to try to assess the situation very quickly. And I do say to them sometimes, you got to be completely honest with me and tell me exactly what happened. I need to know everything. And I'll sign the NDA later. That we deal in credibility and oftentimes in confidentiality. And we need to know everything. And sometimes it's ugly and it's regrettable, but in order to be able to help an organization through this, we've got to know everything.
Have you had a client lie to you and you find yourself, you've done a lot of work, but with wrong information? Have you dealt with that?
No, that's never happened. That's never happened. Maybe I'm lucky, I guess. A lot of the times what we get involved with is litigation communication. And there have been times where I know from the beginning that I'm probably on the losing side, but they still need to get their message across and communicate to their audiences about their point of view and what they're doing. So I've worked on plenty of wins and some losses in the court of law.
John, I have another question. Talk loud. This is a fascinating subject. By the way, we have a second in line of command, public safety, and I've noticed that he's been taking notes. Has there been a case when you made a recommendation and the firm says, no, I'm going to go with what
Yes.
I want to do?
Yes. They're paying us. They have the right not to take our advice. And it does have, I've dispensed plenty of advice that hasn't gotten taken. And there was a book written recently where there's a whole chapter in the book about this ugly incident that happened at this organization, and it was a direct result of the client not taking our advice. I don't know what to say. The check cleared. I mean, sometimes I have to just be okay with that. They have the right not to take our advice. Like I said, a lot of times we're in a tug-of-war with attorneys, and they've got to make a decision. And sometimes these decisions cost people their jobs. And I just do the best I can and my colleagues, we just try to do the best we can to advise based on what we know and what we see. But yeah, it's like anything else in professional services. Sometimes they say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do something else. Okay.
From your professional perspective, do you think the city of Detroit handled the bankruptcy crisis very well? I mean, for what reason? For example, it's a bankruptcy and you have to accept it, or you need to respond to those crises?
I think overall that was handled very well, considering how complex it was, how enormous it was, how you had multiple parties involved. I thought, and I read, there's a great book if you're interested in it that Nathan Bomey, who is a Free Press reporter now at USA Today, wrote called Detroit Resurrected, where it's all kind of behind the scenes of how it all came together. And if you look at what was being communicated publicly and look what was happening behind the scenes, it was pretty close, which means that there was a high level of candor with the audience. It was as serious as Kevin Orr communicated that it was on a regular basis. So I think there's a lot of good case studies there and a lot of examples, not just because it was successful from a legal standpoint, but the community was pretty well informed throughout that. And I think those guys did a good job.
A more recent example, this morning, Michigan Radio announced that MSU has suspended the gymnastics coach as part of the ongoing investigation of their gymnastics doctor, suspended without any public comment. If they were your client, how would you advise them to handle that situation?
Yeah, those are really tough situations because of all of the laws that are in effect that govern how universities are supposed to deal with those situations. But oftentimes, you can calm a situation by removing a controversial character from a story for a period of time. And that's something that we look at in those situations. It's not always the right answer. Sometimes it's the knee-jerk decision. I don't know enough about this situation to know, whether or not I would have advised that, but it is something we often consider is if there's a particular individual who's a lightning rod and is attracting so much negative attention that you can't conduct the business of trying to figure out what happened and move on from it. Sometimes removing that individual from the situation for a period of time can be helpful. So I'm not surprised that they would look at that, but I don't know whether or not that was the right thing.
And, Ben? Get my workout today.
So Matt, thinking about the follow-up to the event and the crisis that you talked about, is there a place for organizations to reach out to media that haven't reached out to them to try to amplify on the story, tell their side of it, to invite them to come and see what you're doing as a sort of a more proactive thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that's always a tough decision. It's like, well, do we invite more attention for this? And every once in a while, the answer is yes, that you might get a different take or a different shake from a different news outlet than maybe somebody who covered the story before. But conventional wisdom is, well, don't do that. Don't invite any more attention for this. But there are times where I think it's helpful. So this organization I talked about where I've really been in recovery mode with them for the last few months, I mean, one of the things I recommended as part of the recovery is the executive director needed to get together with the editor of the newspaper in their community. And that has resulted now in multiple stories and a relationship where I really feel like if the situation had to play itself out over again, it would be different. Because we would have at least gotten a phone call saying, here's the story we're working on. And rather than an hour before the story gets published, give us a statement. So I think it's important to think creatively about these things and not rule anything out until you've talked about it. Because a certain tactic might fit a need that conventional wisdom wouldn't make obvious.
Another question, John, I have. Do organizations have a place within human resources to take care of crisis? You see that happening?
Oh yeah, HR is an important factor in this. Like I said, so much of what ends up becoming bad news starts out internally within an organization. So HR plays an important role in trying to get situations handled from the onset so that they don't escalate into a crisis. So, I was in a situation one time about a business transaction, and it was great to have in the room the CEO, the CFO, the Chief Human Resources Officer, Chief Marketing Officer, and me to be able to really talk this through from a variety of perspectives. That was a really healthy situation, and it resulted in a one-day story. The news got reported, and the internal audiences kind of got it and understood, and everybody moved on. So I think it's really important to have all these seats at the table. The challenge, and we talked about social media and some of the other factors, is it has to happen quickly. Some organizations are really well prepared to do that. Some drag their feet. Sometimes that has to do with people on the inside admitting that there's a crisis or a potential crisis. And one of the biggest crises I've ever worked on, when I got the call, it was a Sunday morning, and I talked to the number 2 person in the organization, and I said, well, you're in crisis right now, and she talked about their CEO and said, well, he doesn't see it that way. That hurt them. Sometimes you got to admit things aren't real good right around you, and you got to deal with it.
So I have a question, actually.
Oh no, this is going to be hard.
No, I think I know that, or maybe the answer should be obvious to this, but developing relationships with reporters or news people or that, is that something you can do proactively that would help should you have a crisis, should you have a situation? Do they I don't know what their ethics are. Do they take it easier potentially on you because they have a relationship?
Well, I feel like the media relationships that we have, we at least know our clients are going to get a fair shake. We don't ask for anything more than that. And that's part of the value that we bring to these situations. However, with the contraction of traditional media, it makes it, some cases, a little bit easier for certain organizations to develop those relationships on their own. That it can only be a good thing, or at least a step in the direction of fairness. And just understanding how the media works helps. I mean, even when we need to do this, when I get brought into a situation in another market, and I don't really know the journalist, but I understand how they operate, how they think, what they're looking for, what their deadlines are. You've got to have somebody involved if it's going to escalate into having media interest who understands how all that works. But keep in mind, your chances of your crisis actually being covered by the news media are less than they've ever been. And that's why I tried to make this more than just about the media. It's about your audiences. And your audiences can find out about things a lot of different ways. But I heard this last night at an event I attended. In 2001, the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press combined had 600 news employees. Today they have 160. So the chances of any story being covered today is a fraction of what it was 16 years ago. And so I wouldn't stay up at late worrying about what's going to happen if the news media finds out about something. You focus on all your audiences, your employees, your donors, anybody else who has an influence on your business. And media will come along with that sometimes. You need to be prepared for it, but I wouldn't obsess over that part of it.
Any other questions for Matt?
Let me just point out a little plug for the Tanner Friedman blog. I don't get paid based on clicks because we're not a news organization, but we routinely write about these topics that we've discussed today. And if you're interested in seeing some examples in kind of real-time analysis, whenever there's anything high profile that fits into the crisis category, I try to do some analysis on the blog as soon as I can, 500 words or so. You can go back and look over the last 10 years. We got some stuff on there. I will tweet occasionally. I will live tweet crisis response while it's happening publicly, not our clients. And that seems to be of interest. And you can email me anytime and ask about any of this stuff, hypothetically or otherwise. Keep the conversation going. This is something I try to pay attention to on a daily basis, whether we're involved or not. I appreciate everybody being here and being involved in the discussion. Please let me know if you have any follow-ups. By the way, I've already announced today that this is the largest crowd to ever witness a business executive-to-executive series at Lawrence Tech, period. So thank you for being part of that large crowd.
Thanks, everybody, for coming today. We appreciate it. Thanks again, Matt. And everybody, March 14th, we have Tom Wilson from District Detroit speaking on how not-for-profits can be involved in that, board members, et cetera. So you'll want to make sure you come to that on March 14th. Thanks very much.